Which medical school is better, Australia or New Zealand? Which is easiest to get into? How competitive is it to get into medical school here? If you're thinking about applying for medical school in New Zealand or Australia, you must watch this. In today's video, we will answer all of those questions to help you choose the best place for you to complete your medical degree. Stay till the very end because I will be sharing a free PDF of this guide as well, so that this video is kept fair and unbiased because I'm a New Zealand doctor myself. I have invited Dr. Adam Rushford, who is a doctor working in Melbourne. He will join me in comparing and contrasting medical schools in Australia and New Zealand.
My name's Adam. I'm a junior doctor currently living in Melbourne, Australia. I'm currently PGY2, so I'm my second year after graduating, my second year working in the hospital, so I'm a resident now, so to speak. And I graduated from Deakin University. That was the medical school that I went to.
That's awesome. And I guess a little bit about me, because this whole video is about comparing and contrasting New Zealand versus Australia. I'm Eunice and I'm PGY4. I am a medical registrar working at Christchurch Hospital, and I graduated from Otago Medical School in New Zealand. Adam, can you tell us why you chose Deakin University? I hear that there's tons of medical school in Australia. Do you know how many? And let us sort of know your thought process.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from memory there are about 21 different medical schools around Australia. They vary between undergraduate and postgraduate programs. There's about 9 undergraduate programs you can get in straight from high school, and there's about 13 postgraduate programs where you have to basically do a prior undergraduate degree to be eligible to study medicine. Monash University is the exception in Victoria, where you can study both undergraduate and postgraduate. Essentially for me, the choice was really, where do I get in? And I think that's probably similar for a lot of students applying. I tried to get in as an undergraduate student, got an interview but didn't quite make the final cut. So like a lot of aspiring medical students, I did a biomedical science degree prior to doing medicine, which is, I feel like, a default for a lot of students trying to get into medicine.
Talk me through about that, because in New Zealand we don't have any postgrad schools. We do have postgrad entry, but not one that's strictly postgrad medical school. What's the duration we're looking at for undergrad versus postgrad med school in Australia?
So the duration differs slightly. I think most undergraduate programs typically range between 5 and 6 years in length, with an optional sort of honours year or BMed Sci year that a lot of students take up. And for postgraduate students, it's typically a straightforward 4 years. The breakdown differs depending on which medical school you end up in, but usually it's around 2 years preclinical in the classrooms, doing lectures, learning about the foundations of clinical skills, the final 2 years being mainly based in the hospital with clinical placements, with tutorials kind of peppered in between as well. By the sounds of things, did you go to an undergraduate program in New Zealand?
Yeah, most people go through undergrad because there's literally only 2 medical schools in New Zealand. I suppose the competition is not that crazy that we sort of need postgraduate entries as a prerequisite, because I think a lot of that probably is from the competition. Would you say?
I think medicine is one of those degrees that are quite desirable for students either leaving high school. A lot of students inevitably miss out straight out of high school, and so they opt for the postgraduate study route. In terms of the breakdown of how many medical schools there are, it's technically the more popular, the route that offers the most amount of spots, essentially. It's a route really often taken up by students.
I'm actually really surprised, something that I didn't know about Australia. I thought that undergrads is a lot more popular. We do have a lot of postgrads. I would say probably just under half are postgrads out of 300 entries. Adam, we'll answer the next question. Where do medical schools in Australia and New Zealand sit in terms of global sort of ranking of universities? Is that something that influence your decision as well?
I know that universities in Australia tend to rank quite highly, which is pretty cool. And I know similarly for the universities in New Zealand as well. Across the board, education, we're fairly lucky with this. Education in both Australia and New Zealand seems to be of a really high standard. But to be honest, when it came down to choosing a university to study at, as I said before, it wasn't really the defining factor. At the end of the day, it was where I could get in, and medicine was ultimately the thing that I wanted to do. So I was happy really to go anywhere, even if that meant moving to different states.
Yeah.
How about you? Was that something that you looked at when you were applying for different universities?
Yeah, I didn't even look into what ranking these universities were, honestly. I would say that rankings are really important in places like the US and Canada, because I simply do think that the matching process is quite different here in New Zealand, and I think maybe in Australia as well, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. It's really important that the states, for example, that you're from a highly regarded medical school, it really increases increase your chance of getting a job and getting your residency matching. But that's totally not the case in New Zealand here. As I say, we've only got 2 medical schools. I would say that the quality of both are pretty similar. Many people from Auckland University that they're going to say something different, but I think we're pretty equal. Just looking up the rankings, we sit pretty similarly, the 2 universities, so I really wasn't fussed about which university I got into for med school. But I think the audience is probably going to be interested in New Zealand versus Australia. Yeah, Adam, you're right that Australia, there are a few universities like University of Sydney and Monash that definitely sit quite high up in sort of the global rankings of universities. Whereas in New Zealand, we're sort of sitting around the hundreds, 150 mark. Just for comparison, Sydney is like 20. But I don't know how much of that actually matters in terms of getting a job, because a lot of these rankings, I think, are based on the number of publications, like their known reputation, rather than how good the grades actually are from the students who graduate from there and whether or not they get a job. I don't think they account for those things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think you have to take these rankings with a grain of salt. If you look across the board, you'll see that different countries have different representation, and I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of the quality of the education that the students receive. As a student in Australia, as you said, the university that you go to doesn't have a massive bearing on where you end up getting a job.
Yeah, awesome. The next question here is, what are the requirements for local students to get into medical school?
It depends whether you're applying through the undergraduate or the postgraduate system. If you go through the undergraduate system, there are a few different factors that students need to consider. The first being obviously your ATAR score, or your score when you finish high school that you receive, that kind of standardized mark based on all the subjects that you do in high school. There's the UCAT, which was previously known as the UMAT back in the day when I sat it. A lot of universities will take into account both of those 2 scores as to whether or not they give you an interview. They amalgamate all of those 3 factors and distribute spots depending on how you fare in each of those 3 things. For postgraduate medicine, it's a little bit similar in the sense that you have your GPA, which is your grade point average from your university studies, and you have your GAMSAT score, which is essentially the postgraduate version of the UCAT, and then after that you have your interview as well. So they take into account those 3 factors primarily.
It sounds pretty similar to the New Zealand one then. Would you say that the weighing of the 3 different components are quite different across different medical schools, or would you say they're fairly similar in terms of like percentages?
Each university has its own different flavor depending on what things they preference or not. It's largely the same, but there are differences slightly in percentages and how different universities weight those 3 things. The best thing to do if you're a student that wants to look into getting into one of these programs is to have a look at if you're a postgraduate student at least, look at the GEMSAS guide, which is like the holy grail in terms of knowing exactly what the different universities are looking for each year. And they update it yearly, and that you can go through and see exactly what the different things each universities are looking for, what different bonuses they give, and what different prerequisites they have based on subjects having studied in your undergraduate degree. So that would definitely be my first point of call in terms of making sure you know what's going on, and also that you don't miss out anything in the application.
Oh, cool. Definitely send me that link later on so I can include it in the description of the video also.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask you, what do you mean by bonuses? Like, are there some things that you could do that would boost your application besides the 3 things?
So universities will offer kind of bonus points, and really it's like a percentage boost based on the score you already have from those combined 3 factors. And they offer bonuses for things like having studied maybe at that university level of study prior. So maybe if you've studied a master's or a PhD, they might offer you a bonus from a financial hardship background. And I think from memory, basically if you're an Australian student and you've been on Centrelink for at least a year, you can be eligible for that bonus. If you've worked in an area of healthcare or a similar field before applying to medicine, you might also be eligible for a bonus. But as I said, each university kind of offers different bonuses, so it'd probably be good to check and see which ones offer which.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. Do you have one for undergrads as well? We link that sort of summarizes everything.
I can have a look and send you a link so you can put it in the description.
That'll be really helpful. Thank you, Adam. Would you happen to know what the requirements for international students to get into medical school in Australia?
It's kind of similar for postgraduate medicine. They look at either GAMSAT or the MCAT, which is, I think a lot lot of listeners will probably be familiar with the MCAT. It's the medical admissions test used in the US and widely internationally. And then an interview. And it's kind of similar for undergrad. They will look at your high school leavers score. Some require a written application depending on which university you're applying to. It differs between the 9 different undergraduate medical schools. And then there'll be an interview as well. You can also sit the UCAT or an equivalent test. I don't think for some medical schools it's not 100% a prerequisite, but for others it is.
Do international students have to do pre-medicine course in Australia before they can get in? Because I know in New Zealand it's a must, like you can't just get in from high school and then get straight into medical school. You have to do that pre-med course that everyone has to do, like any other local student.
From my understanding, they can go straight into the undergraduate medical degree, similar to local students as well. When they finish high school, they go straight into the undergrad degree.
Wait, does that mean that you guys don't have a pre-medicine course?
No, if you're an undergrad, you go straight into your medical degree. There's no distinct pre-medical course for undergraduate students. It's all one combined degree.
That probably is quite a big difference between New Zealand and Australia medical school. The prerequisite to get into pre-med is pretty low for both of the universities. For University of Otago, you basically just need to pass everything in year 13, which is a pretty low entry point to start your first year. And then for University of Auckland, I believe you need to start getting merits and excellences that stack up your points into rank scores to get into that pre-med course. It's once you get into the pre-medicine course, it's just a 1-year program that you work really, really hard to compete with everyone trying to get into these health professional programs, medicine being one of them. They look at grades, they look at your UCAT score, and in Auckland as well, they do an interview. So in Otago, they don't interview any students, which is very different. In Otago, the academic score is 2/3 and then 1/3 is UCAT. In Auckland, grades is 60%, UCAT raw score is 50%, and then the interview itself is 25%.
I should have said, so the standard kind of breakdown would be like 50-50 GPA or ATAR score versus GAMSAT and UCAT. That's the hurdle to getting an interview. And then typically it's a third split. That sounds incredibly intense and cutthroat. I can imagine, the environment would be pretty rough for that year.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but you meet very like-minded people though, because everyone's got the same mindset. Everyone's probably got their shit together for studying to even make it through half of pre-medicine, because most people will drop out by the end of semester 1. Like you see half of the lecture theatre gone. I guess for international students in New Zealand, for undergrad, they do have to graduate from a high school that is recognised by New Zealand. So there's this list of high schools. If not, you have to do year 13 in New Zealand. That's what my sister did, because I'm originally from Malaysia. My sister's high school back in Malaysia wasn't recognised by the University of Otago. She finished high school in Malaysia but had to go back to do 1 extra year of high school in New Zealand in order to then apply for health sciences. There is another pathway if you don't want to do an extra year of high school. What you could do is you could do a foundational year at the university, which is also 1 year, and that prepares you quite well for health sciences too.
That's really interesting. I guess it's just that other thing to look out for
international students, because I think most of my subscribers are international students trying to get into medical school. That extra layer of complexity sometimes explains why New Zealand med schools have less international students, I feel.
Yeah, very different. I know that international students, there's a lot more things to consider, and it definitely makes, on top of moving countries, if you're not already living in that country that you're applying to, the process can be really challenging. It's amazing, those international students that have gotten in and studied and done really, really well. Kudos.
I wanted to ask, how competitive are medical schools in Australia? I know this is quite a wide topic. We'll see how it goes, and then we can back it up with a bit of numbers and stats if we have some. Do you want to start, Adam?
Yeah, for sure. I generally try to keep these answers vague because it is hard to give specifics, because the medical schools vary so greatly. And as I said, there are different bonuses and different factors that change the likelihood of you being accepted into one of these medical schools. However, in saying that, I will make just a general broad statement that it is quite competitive. Obviously, there is a spectrum in terms of how competitive it is to get into different medical schools, depending on how in demand, that classic supply-demand equation. So some universities will be really sought after. If they're quite a well-regarded or highly ranked university, they might be more preferable. or if there's only one university in that state, then all of the students that are applying from that state will probably want to apply for that university. So it might be a bit more popular, a bit more difficult to get into, and therefore the cutoff scores will be a little bit higher. In terms of exact scores, it is hard to say. Typically for undergraduate students, domestic students, the ATAR score will be a really big factor. There's a common sort of misconception that you have to get, if you're from Australia, you'll understand what this means, but you have to get 99.9 or 99.95, like the top of the top, to be able to get into medical school as an undergraduate. And I think obviously scoring really well gives you a really good chance of getting in, but you don't have to be nailing every single exam. You don't have to be perfection on every account to get in. I would say you still really need a high competitive ATAR score, but I think that kind of misconception precludes a lot of people from applying because they think it's beyond reach. I would definitely just say have a go and sit the UCAT and see where you go from there. In terms of the UCAT score, there are preliminary cutoffs percentile wise that universities won't consider you if you score below that cutoff, but I'd say having the percentile above around the 80th percentile probably at the very least will make you somewhat competitive depending on your ATAR and the other factors. For postgraduate, having a high GPA gives you a better score, but I'd say definitely around that 6.5 and upwards mark will make you somewhat competitive, balanced with a GAMSAT score of about 65 and upwards will make you somewhat competitive for an interview. But again, the spectrum varies so dramatically because there are students with different bonuses, different factors, different universities. Yeah. Take that all with a grain of salt, but I know students love hearing scores because it's juicy and they love having something to aim for and to go for.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I can appreciate that. It's really hard to comment, especially since there's like 20 something medical schools in Australia. To just give a blanket statement is very hard, so I appreciate that. Those are probably similar numbers in New Zealand medical school. I've actually got the report from the University of Otago in terms of what the average academic scores were to get into medical school. 2021, it was 94.3% is the average academic score. Last year, 2023, it sort of shot up to 95.57% for both Otago and Auckland. How competitive it is that year depends on how smart your cohort is. It's sort of like a bell curve situation where there isn't like a cutoff mark necessarily. It's just whoever you're competing with. So for example, in my year, getting an average of 93% could mean you get in med school entry first round. But in 2023, you're waitlisted now. Competition for local students have been increasing every year, and part of that is driven by introducing a lot more positions for Pacifica and Māori students. I'm just quoting someone who said this on the Auckland website, that the overall acceptance rate for undergraduate students, for domestic students anyway, is realistically about less than 10%. I don't actually know how true this number is, but this was actually an article written by Harry. Do you remember Harry? I saw his post.
Of course. That's really interesting. I guess that in itself, that number means that it is quite a competitive thing to get into. I tend to find those acceptance rates sometimes a bit hard to grapple with in terms of making sense of what they mean, but I guess in the Australian setting, it varies so much between the different universities to be able to quote a number. But I'd consider a whole bunch of different factors when deciding whether or not to apply, in addition to just the acceptance rate.
Absolutely, that's for sure. I didn't look into any of these when I was applying. I was just trying to focus on what I can control, which is working hard, looking at how I can practice for my UCAT. If I was preparing for the interview, practicing those. Despite all of these numbers, it's sort of important to just control what we can.
You know, there are kind of definitely two different types of students. There's, you know, the ones that will put their head down and study and not really focus on the scores. And then there's the other types, which is probably more like me in the sense that I did study and work hard, but I always like to know what my chances are, where I sit. I like crunching the numbers a little bit. And if you are kind of like that, there's a great forum online called Paging Doctor, and they often release a spreadsheet of all of those who have been offered spots and what scores they've been given. Again, I take that sort of stuff with a grain of salt, but if you are interested and want to know a little bit about what your chances are, by all means take a look at that. But I don't think my self-control was good enough not to be able to research and see what was out there.
Fair enough. We've got a similar one as well, which I can include in the description. And I was also interested in, do you know how many positions in general there are for international students that are set aside for Deakin Medical School, for example?
It varies between different universities. For Deakin specifically, there were about 140 to 150 students depending on the year's intake. And from memory, about 30 of those are set aside for international students. And again, that varies slightly depending on the year.
So we have 20 to 30 positions set aside for international students as well, but our cohort is 300 people. So that probably comes down to, oh, my maths is not good. Is that 10%?
Yeah.
Yeah, 10% for international medical students across Otago and Auckland.
Yeah, okay. Maybe a slightly smaller proportion by the sounds of things.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, as I said, it varies between different universities, but some universities will offer as many as 50% of places to international students. So I guess if you're an
Wow.
international student, that's important to kind of keep that in mind.
Do you know which university does that? That's crazy.
I think from memory, don't quote me on the exact figures, but University of Sydney and University of Queensland, from memory, have pretty high international student intakes.
Okay.
University of Melbourne as well. But yeah, worth taking a look at the GEMSAS guide, as I said before, and sussing that out.
Thank you, Adam. What is the cost of medical schools in general in Australia for domestic students? And then we can compare that to international students.
It's a good question. So for domestic students, it'll kind of depend on which spot you're granted. Students can either get Commonwealth supported places or full fee paying places. If you're a CSP student, it roughly costs around between $10,000 and $12,000 Australian dollars per year of study. And unless you decide to pay that fully upfront, that'll typically get paid as you start earning money, which is taken out of your pre-tax income. If you're a full fee paying student, you'll pay similar to perhaps what an international student might pay. That varies depending on the university, but can range between 50 upwards of 70,000 Australian dollars a year. Again, it depends on each of the unis.
What's CSP, Adam?
Basically, it's traditionally the standard domestic position for a university student, regardless of what you're studying. What that means is that the government subsidizes your position, so you're not paying the full university quoted fee. It's a lot more affordable for domestic students who want to study at university.
How can you become a CSP? Is that something that you're automatically granted, or do you have to apply for it?
I think you automatically qualify if you're an Australian citizen. I'm not sure how it works depending on if you're a permanent resident or not, but I know definitely if you're an Australian citizen, you'll have the option for CSP.
Would you be able to give us like a number for how much a local student, if they are a CSP for the whole degree, if it was an undergrad?
If it's a 5-year degree,
Yeah.
the whole degree could cost around $60,000. If it's a 6-year degree, a little bit more. And if you're a postgraduate student, it's a similar sort of yearly cost of between $10,000 and $12,000. So obviously that only being a 4-year degree makes it a little bit less in total. But that would be the kind of rough quote.
In New Zealand, there's only 2 schools. Both of them are 6 years long. So for a local student, which means you're either a New Zealand citizen or a permanent resident, it's $90,000 in total for the whole degree. I worked out the specifics, but I can't remember it anymore. Preclinical and clinical years are different in pricing, but altogether it's about $90,000 for the whole degree. You can pay that with student loans, and that just gets cut out of your salary once you start working. But as an international student, it works out to be $500,000 New Zealand dollars for the whole degree, which is a whole lot of money compared to a local student. It's big
Yeah.
numbers, eh?
It's big numbers. It definitely adds to the considerations of studying, but definitely a big difference.
If you are an Australian citizen coming to New Zealand, you pay the same fees as a New Zealander if you were studying in New Zealand medical school. So you wouldn't be considered like an international student unless you are doing distant learning. So that's just a little FYI. But I don't think the same works for a New Zealander going to Australia to study, hey?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's correct, which is unfortunate. It sounds like that we copped the better end of the deal there. But yeah, hopefully that changes.
Speaking of money, because it's all very expensive, do you know if there are any scholarships available for international students, and roughly how many positions for Deakin University?
Oh, so again, my default answer for a lot of these questions is it does vary depending on the university and how many scholarships. For
Yeah.
Deakin, they do offer scholarships. I think there are a handful. By that, I mean 2 to 4 spots spots from memory. But yeah, you'll sort of have to check how that updates year to year. Usually they're pretty transparent in terms of what scholarships they offer on the university website and the course website, but they are quite competitive generally.
Same here in New Zealand, but I was just looking at the Auckland University website the other day. It said that there were like 100 scholarships each year for international students, but that's not specific for medical school. I think there are a few requirements and criteria and things to check out. In Otago, it's a lot less transparent and they're not very clear about how many are available. They're like, oh, it's variable, you should email us to find out, sort of thing, which is very interesting. We're coming up to our last question. This is a question that a lot of international students have asked me about. Would you be able to touch on what the cost of living is when you were a student and whether or not it's even possible to attempt part-time work?
I'll firstly start off cost of living in Melbourne in general. A few things to consider, obviously rent, food, basic living expenses. In terms of rent, inner city Melbourne, for maybe like a one bedroom apartment, you might be looking at around 400 Australian dollars a week, maybe a little bit more depending on which sort of area. And that would be kind of similar in other major cities in Australia. Usually the major cities will be a little bit more expensive, but if you're living in a more regional or rural area for your studies, it might be a little bit more affordable. When I was studying in Geelong, the rent prices were slightly less than they were in Melbourne. Rent was maybe like $300 a week on average per person, or maybe a tad less. It kind of varies depending on the city that you're in. In terms of being able to work whilst studying, I think it probably depends on the individual and how much you feel like you're able to juggle at once. But I would generally say it is possible to work whilst you're studying. I had a lot of friends that worked in cafes, or tutoring's a really common one. I did a bit of tutoring throughout medical school. And for me personally, I knew that my schedule was a bit all over the place. I found that university was very blotchy, sort of here or there in terms of the scheduling, and you'd often be studying after hours. So something that was flexible like tutoring was a really good option for a lot of students.
Yeah.
How did you find things when you were studying?
Good point. I didn't work during med school. I did have like a little sort of side job that I had with a hall of residents that I was staying at. I was managing the tutors there, so I wasn't tutoring, but my job was to find tutors for the students that were living in the college or the halls of residence preparing for health sciences. So that meant that I don't have to pay for half of my halls of residence fees. That saved money, but in a way that wasn't really active income, I suppose. And that was definitely really manageable in medical school. I would say that I would spend maybe about 5 to 6 hours a week doing that. I think it's manageable to do part-time work, especially if, something a bit more flexible, like you say, tutoring is a great one. But if you were to do something like retail, which is probably easier to find a job, then I think doing it in the weekend is quite possible. If you're willing to sacrifice a few hours of studying in the weekend to earn a bit of cash, I think that's very doable and very, very common in New Zealand to be working part-time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you be able to give us a number for when you were students? How much were you spending a year on cost of living?
Oh, it's tough. When I was a postgrad student, I'd moved out of home, so I was paying rent. Rent itself was probably around $10,000 Australian dollars a year, give or take. And then food on top of that, a few $1,000s, and then social events and travel probably on top of that. So it definitely does add up sort of around $15,000 to $20,000 a year, probably at least, just to live.
Yeah, that's pretty standard. I was looking up the cost of living, and this was quoted by the University of Otago website. It says that you'll need around $20,000 a year to live comfortably as a student in Dunedin, which is where Otago is. And then in Auckland, because it is a big city, so you expect like a lot more, maybe $25,000 to $30,000 a year.